Visual effects is part of the movie making team.
It's pretty magical to close the loop on reading a script and then just seeing a sequence like Westeros.
I did shed a tear during the big sequence that we spent months and months and months working on.
I have to remind myself this, especially episode 4, that's TV we're talking about. That's some of the best stuff I've ever seen.
There isn't another company that works in our space that can take a project all the way from its inception, all the way through every facet of production under one roof. For Pixomondo to have been critically involved in multiple seasons of Game of Thrones, to have been intrinsic to the visual effects work on House of the Dragon Season 1. House of the Dragon Season 2 rolls around and there's a new visual effects supervisor, Daði Einarsson, who doesn't know Pixo. And we kind of had to go back a step and really earn the right to be considered for the show. We were awarded a small amount of pre-visualization work, which quickly grew once Tom Horton and Daði had seen what we were capable of delivering at speed. Our role grew, our footprint on set grew, and of course all that flowed into visual effects.
We came on at that early stage. We designed sequences and shots with the production crew. We took that work through the shoots and helped support there with virtual production and tech viz, and then carried that through to the teams who were working on all the post work at Pixomondo as well. And we built our team bespokely to actually accommodate that, knowing that that was the whole goal.
We got the initial scripts in and storyboards, and we started working with Tom, the VFX producer, and Daði, and it was really a small team initially, led by Matt Perrin.
Previs is the most creative part of the process. It's where you start with a blank page as opposed to like if you're doing finaling animate, or you're animating a creature in a live action shot. The constraints are quite small, so getting finaling animators involved in previs is like, it's such a creative part of the process.
I think working on previs forces the animators to really think about the story, because there it is about developing the story. If you're in visual effects, you can quite easily as an artist get into a tunnel vision and just focus on your shot.
The Battle of Westeros, it was a biggie. It was going to take up the whole team effort, several weeks or a few months in the end, ultimately, of design work. There's a huge crowd of effects, there's big environment shots, there's all this stuff, and then there's the dragons. Some of the shots we were designing were really ambitious. The motion of the dragon was quite ambitious. The camera moves themselves were quite ambitious. And we had 3 dragons in this sequence. So there's Sunfire, Malise and Vega, and they're all very different. They're very different sizes, and that affects the performance that you put into them.
So a buck rig is actually an adaptation of what we call a motion base rig. And a motion base is essentially a platform which moves. The motion base is normally hydraulic or motorized. A buck rig is designed for riding a dragon. Motion control is using data to control a camera on a robot head, which allows you to do things like perspective-only moves. So for example, if there's a big CG shot and you don't have the space to do it, you film the actor in perspective only. So you shoot the element for reprojection on the CG camera later on in post. The buck rig in this instance, the main reason for it is obviously to give the performance for the actors. We essentially take the animation, we take the previous scene, restage the action in that particular shot, and then we put it into our virtual set in 3D so that we can solve the move. And that allows us to see if it's going to work, and it also allows us to produce visualization in the form of tech viz to validate the shot for the client. They would then compare it with the previs just to make sure that it was all in line.
We came up with various solutions, did a lot of R&D before, and several months before we actually went on set, so that the live footage from the camera can be put onto the previs, that we can validate and also see how is the shot going to look in the end. Because when you're there and you just have the robot, the buck, and lots of blue, and the LED panels used for lighting and not really content this time around, sure, the camera motion and everything looks cool in the end, but does it work in the context of what we're trying to achieve?
So we used the LEDs for various things. We used it for lighting, blue screen that was following the first stream of the camera, that was animated as the buck rotated. We also used loops for cueing the actors if they had to do a specific performance on the buck, and also eyeline. So for example, if Meleys is turning round to look at Renice, we would have a dot that she could follow so she knew where to look. The beauty of that is, again, because it's all a real-time system, it's tied in with Unreal and it's all synced with the buck. So it meant that we could animate all of these as the buck's moving to the timing of the move. So it was all synced up. We could throw fire elements on there to get the fire blast off Aegon's armor. And really a lot of it was driven by PJ. He'd never worked with us before, the DP. He was new to working with us and our bespoke system. And during the testing phase, we had a few days of tests before he first came in, and he got used to it and very quickly became familiar with knowing what to change. We'd also put the wing flaps on there for shadows, and those dragons were actually running in Unreal straight from the previs, and each dragon has its own cadence, so it's very important that that matched the buck rig. So yeah, there's lots of reasons why the LEDs were useful, which you don't often think about because a lot of people think background's content.
One of our mantras is that fantasy only really works if you ground it in reality. So if you come up with a camera language, a shooting language, where you have basically methodology-wise 2 types of cameras we wanted to establish, which was dragon-mounted camera for the coverage on people, or dragon to dragon. So it's like the camera operator would be on a dragon somewhere near the dragon. So you have some kind of a realism based to how you control your cinematography.
I remember the conversations with Tom Horton early on was, if you give us the prep time and you let us amalgamate with previs enough, we can do this. And there's a big difference between animating in a previs scene or a 3D film scene and then having it work in the real world on a huge mechanical rig. We don't want to be too destructive of the animation. We're very mindful of that. The whole reason why we got the animators in early was so that that animation would transpose through the process, through the pipeline, all the way from production all the way to post.
When I would start kind of comparing to Game of Thrones, dragons were always a big part of it, but actually they were carefully sprinkled over the mostly 10 episodes. With House of the Dragon, it already started to become a much more dragon-driven storytelling.
To make sure we can, differentiate the different dragons. Of course, if you have a shot with them fighting against one another, the scale difference is quite apparent because you can just compare them one to the other. But of course, you want to make sure that even if you just see a single dragon in a shot, you want to emphasize what the scale is. So Veigar was huge. You want to make sure that the animation underlines that size and that scale and the weight of that animal by comparison to a smaller dragon, which is, doing much faster wing flaps, is more agile.
When you see the silhouette, you should be able to recognize what dragon it is. Because very often you're looking against the bright sky and you don't really see the colors, but you see the shape.
When we do the turntables for the dragon to show the asset and the progression of the asset to the client, we're putting him into a pose that kind of represents these character traits already, rather than just putting him into a technical T-pose.
Given the large scale of the environment, especially an environment like Dragonstone, where you had the castle, the island in which it sits on, the bridge leaning down to an additional crescent island, and then the mountains there and all the foliage and the water, we had to come up with very creative ways on how to actually render these environments. One of the main challenges with this, again, is that we're building on top of something that already exists. And our audience, our modern audience, is very smart. And when they look at something and it doesn't feel right, they can spot it right away. So we had to really pay attention to details.
One of the things we learned quite early on is, although the show has fantastical elements, the vision of the showrunner and the client-side supervisor was like, this is not a fantasy show. So we had to really ground our environments in reality. So we had to be honest about making sure this looks photorealistic.
The main kind of vision or goal that I had was to bring the dragons more into character life. So rather than just being a means of transport or weapons, to actually have them emote.
When we're thinking about animation, we're always trying to, let's say, from the design or to the execution, we're always comparing it to real world animals.
And I think a big part here is, of course, also the connection with their respective dragon riders. So for example, Meleys and Rhaenys, you can take some cues off her acting before the battle starts, where she, puts her head against the dragon, and you can see there is a deep connection. The scenes just before they die, she thinks Veigar is defeated, they fly off, she looks at Meleys turns her head back to her, and you have a shot reverse shot of the actress against the dragon. Of course, there is an emotion in the acting of the dragon rider, and you can play against that, with the dragon, as two actors would basically. Sticking with the battle at Rook's Rest, of course there's a lot of visual effects involved there, so it's not just the dragons, it's the environment, which, they had a relocation that they filmed at, but it wasn't large enough, so we needed to extend it even for shots that are based on the ground. And then for aerial shots, there was some drone footage, but most of what we see is actually CG environments, just to convey the scale of the battlefield and, the whole environment around that. And then these cliffs, just behind the castle, they're based on a relocation, but still they don't exist in that way, so they're also full CG. Then the army, same thing there. They had extras on set, all dressed up, but not as many as the story called for. So there was quite a bit of crowd extensions there to make the army a large force as the showrunners wanted them to be. Then we have a lot of destruction, so not just the fire from the dragons, but also as Vega is crashing down, there's this big wave of dust and debris flying around from the impact. We have the other two dragons, fiery crashes into the castle and into the forest with lots of fire and smoke. And then we have the aftermath, where everything is just like this hellscape with embers flying through the air, ash raining down, smoke.
Especially when we are airborne, when the animation gets changed, the camera might also be adjusted, right? When the camera is adjusted, we see something different in the background. So how can we make sure that we have a new background pretty fast? We explored the idea of what can we actually do in Unreal? Having a much faster design process, meaning adding new trees or new bushes in the background. So the original idea was that only when we see some of the dragons' head close up and we see some environment in the background, that it might work out just doing this with a real-time engine render. And over the course of the project, it changed a lot. So at the end, we had quite a high number of environments which got rendered in Unreal versus the ones we did in the traditional approach. We're always trying just to find new ways, just to free up the animation process until the very end and still delivering high quality results. There's so many small puzzle pieces which need to come together just to create one single shot, right? Every shot was so complex. Having the communication between the departments is crucial.
Everything that we've been moving towards is to diversify our creative services and to really pioneer this integrated way of working where we can deliver more than beautiful visual effects work, but we can be a creative partner throughout the entire production process. Being able to combine our many studios and our many artists and producers across multiple disciplines, but it's also generating work at the very, very highest level. The production values which are delivered across the whole series of House of the Dragon are exceptional. They're very best in class, and there are some sequences within the series which are truly jaw-dropping.